Students. Today we're going to talk a little bit about print journalism, even though many people think that print will become extinct really soon. We do want to talk about print journalism because there still are some jobs out there, and some of the more prestigious news organizations still print and paper, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Philadelphia Inquirer, etc. But the changes in mass media over the last 20 years have occurred at lightning speed. The changes induced by the printing press back in 1350 took years and centuries to evolve. In contrast, the changes induced today by the internet and mobile technologies evolve every single day. And then while some argue that print publications will become extinct, we still need to know how to write for them in order to understand the history of our craft and the foundations on which all mass media writing were built. Note that with the advent of each new mass media platform, print has continued to exist. So, for example, books were the first medium. Then there were newspapers. Then there were magazines in the 1700s. Then there was film in the late 1800s, early 1900s. Then there was radio, film, television, etc. And every time one of those new mediums came to fruition because of technology, print had to adapt. Print newspapers had to adapt. Books had to adapt, and they've still survived. And my guess is that they're going to survive in some point, in some form, one way or another. At least I hope they do. So the types of the types of news stories you see in print newspapers are basically these kinds. You have meetings, speeches, obituaries, the weather, crime and court, periodical and anniversary stories. For example, Thanksgiving is going to be a big Thanksgiving story every single year. The Odunde Festival that I referenced in this week's assignment is another something that you might cover every single year. Um, and you also have features. We'll talk about a little bit more in a minute. Features usually offer new stories. For example, a story might be something that I'll do it out of the back of their thumb, something like that. Um, However, news stories can become feature stories if you look deep enough into them. For example, a reporter may report on a string of catalytic converter thefts on a certain street. They, along with their editor, may then decide to do a whole feature on the issue of catalytic converter thefts across the city. The feature will add more detail and can be told with more vivid language. So while features are generally a little bit softer news, you can still have a feature story that uses a more narrative style and that goes more in depth into an issue and still have it be hard news, right? Feature stories usually include personality profiles, events, and phenomena. According to Stovall, there are several different kinds of features. There's the anecdotal feature, kind of uses an example. There's the suspended interest feature that operates kind of like a detective novel. There's profiles. You see these all the times of prominent figures or even person on the street, right? We might profile somebody, our block captain, for example. And then sometimes you just have a question and answer. This usually happens with more prominent people. Not my favorite form of a feature because it's just the written question and then it's the answer of the person. For personality profile, I actually prefer that the reporter interview the person, do some background research, and then kind of almost you can go in chronological order from the time they were born to the present, or you can just kind of like pick out the most important quotes and and add a description to it. Some of the characteristics of feature writing, it's more descriptive, has a little bit more of a literary tone. So let's take the example of the catalytic converter story. A hard news lead for this story might look like this. 7 catalytic converters were stolen last night on the 700 block of Federal Street, according to police. Who, what, where, when, attributed, right to the point. A feature lead might look more like this, a little bit more narrative, a little bit more literary, a little bit more descriptive. In the early morning hours, thieves searched Philadelphia streets for precious metals hidden beneath the cars of unsuspecting owners. It doesn't really give you the whole, the whole 4 questions or 5 questions. But what it does is it kind of sets the scene, and then you kind of go into more detail. So description and detail are key to features. You want description of actions, description of people, description of objects and places. This means that the parts of speech that are going to be your best friends when writing a feature are going to go as nouns and verbs. So the parts of a feature story. The lead, it can be more than one sentence. For a hard news lead, we'd like to keep it around one sentence, 30 words. You could have a couple sentences for a feature lead, right? Then you have the engine paragraph, which is kind of like the nut graph for a hard news story. Usually the third paragraph kind of puts things into context. The body, you're still going to use quotes for a feature story, right? Especially feature stories, actually, because people in your feature are going to give it more descriptive, give it that more literary tone because they're going to be characters. You also want to add details and examples in the body, and then also you usually have an ending in the feature story. Whereas with a hard news story, we use inverted pyramid that it can be cut off. A feature story usually has a specific ending where you kind of wrap it up, which you don't do for a hard news story. Um, Long form and literary journalism, right? A lot of magazines, the Atlantic, the New Yorker, some of the most prestigious magazines out there have long form and literary journalism, right? Now, in our digital age, we can see if we read Huffington Post or even the Inquirer or other, other papers, news stories are getting shorter. The attention span of the reader is getting shorter. There's so much competition. These articles are getting shorter. But sometimes a story is so compelling it requires, multiple pages in order to tell it. So we use long form in literary journalism. Some conventions of long-form journalism, it uses inverted pyramid style, but it's longer and more detailed. It, of course, uses the attribution that we've been going over for hard news stories. It still uses short sentences and short paragraphs. It uses simplicity. It has adherence to AP style, right? So long-form journalism is simply a news story that is much, much longer. It's a lot different from literary journalism because literary journalism uses literary techniques to tell the story. Some of those literary techniques are, adding similes and metaphors, a little bit more poetic language, using those elements of fiction where you talk about point of view, conflict, setting, point of view, conflict, setting, character, theme, and meaning, right? So you're going to use those literary techniques for literary journalism, hence the name. Usually what happens is when we're starting out our careers as journalists, we'll get these short stories. We might even be, sent to do obituaries, right? When we first start off. Long form journalism and literary journalism, we usually have to work our way up to it, right? Unless we have a great idea for some kind of investigative piece, then our editors can give us the green light. So editing and rewriting, we already do this for our 101 and 102 classes. It's a little bit different when journalism, right? Because a lot of times we have deadlines. We are writing under a real time constraint. So we don't have the luxury of writing and of editing and rewriting many, many times. That's usually why we have copy editors and editors. Usually we write the story, we edit it and revise it ourselves. We send it to our editor, right, the editor of our section. They read it, then they send it to a copy editor. Usually the copy editor makes corrections, does a little bit of fact checking, and might even come up with a headline, and then it might even go to the main editor if that main editor has time to read it. And even with all those steps, as we can see, if we read newspapers, there's mistakes in them. But all writers need to edit and revise. And even though most mass media organizations have copy editors, you should try to make your story as perfect as possible before turning it over to the next person. At the very least, before you turn your story to the next person, you should look for spelling, grammar, and style, verbs and verb tense, wordiness, take out any unnecessary words. Make sure that you've answered all the who, what, where, when, why, and how. Make sure that you're consistent with your verb tense, consistent with your numbers, consistent with your dates, consistent with your names. Check for accuracy, right? Accuracy is just as important as grammar and spelling. And if you have time, make sure you read it out loud because a lot of us, we've done this in 101 and 102. Sometimes when you listen to what you've written, you can actually hear some of the errors or some of the wordiness. So you want to try to read it to yourself if you can. And that's it for print journalism. Next time, we're going to go over writing for the web and keep up the good work. Thanks for all your insights, and let's keep going.